I will never forget the way my heart broke that night, as if it had been a piece of glass thrown against the floor in front of everyone. My daughter Emily was turning 30. I had looked forward to that day, convinced it would be a celebration, where finally she would recognize everything I did for her. I had dreamed of hugging her, of hearing a simple, "Thank you, Dad," that would instantly reward so many sleepless nights, so many days of hard work where my back creaked under the weight of the years, but which I endured because I believed it was worth it. I entered the hall decorated with bright lights, with tables full of flowers and glasses reflecting the glow of the chandeliers. I thought that this was a setting worthy of seeing us smile together. But what happened that night was not a party. It was my public sentencing. It all started with a toast. She my little girl, because to me she will always be that, even if her lips spit poison at me, took the glass delicately and walked to the center of the room. Her eyes shone, her dress sparkled, and the crowd of guests looked at her with admiration. I hoped to hear my name on her lips, even simply, perhaps, a gesture of gratitude. I leaned forward at the table, my heart racing, waiting for her to say the word "Dad." And then, with a wide smile and a firm voice, she pointed to her father-in-law, that man, in the expensive suit and arrogant look, and surrounded him with a hug. "This is my real father," she said with a confidence that froze my blood. The silence lasted only a few seconds, but for me it was an eternity. And then, like a wave that destroys without mercy, came the thunder of applause. Everyone, absolutely everyone, applauded. Some stood up, others smiled with complicity, and I felt the floor disappear beneath my feet. I remained motionless with the glass in my hands, observing the scene as if I did not belong to my own life. I could not understand it. I could not assimilate that the daughter I raised with my own hands, whom I fed, clothed, and educated, would give herself in that way to the embrace of another man, publicly denying my existence. The worst part was not the applause, nor the laughter, nor the looks that avoided me as if I were a stranger in that celebration. The worst was when she turned her head toward me, and without blinking said aloud, "Dad, you can leave now." Her voice had no trace of affection, not even respect. It was an order, dry, cruel, spoken with the coldness of someone who sweeps away the memory of a lifetime with a gesture. I remained seated, not reacting, hoping she would correct herself, that she would say it was a joke. But she didn't, and then the laughter of some guests filled the void like knives sticking into my chest. I stood up slowly, dignity trembling in my hands. I felt all eyes following me as I walked toward the door. Some looked away in shame, others watched me with contempt, as if I were a pathetic figure who had to disappear from the perfect picture of the party. As I moved forward, memories began to invade me. The first birthday I organized for her with barely a few coins. The new shoes I bought her when I didn't even have money for my own. The nights when her fever kept me awake and I begged God not to take her. All that burned inside me while her words, those cursed words, echoed over and over again. "This is my real father." When I reached the door of the hall, I stopped for a moment. I wanted to turn around, confront her, scream the truth of who I was to everyone, of what I had done, of how no one there would have seen that woman become an adult if it weren't for me. But I held back. There was something in her look, that mixture of contempt and satisfaction, that told me if I spoke, she would only laugh more. And then I decided to remain silent, because I understood there was something else behind her gesture, something I couldn't explain at that moment, but which burned like a secret. That night didn't end there. When I crossed the threshold still, with the echo of applause and laughter, I heard the noise of the microphone. It was my son-in-law. His voice rose loud, trembling, cutting through the atmosphere. "Enough," he said, and the murmur of the guests died down. I, with my hand still on the doorknob, froze. I heard him take a breath and add, "There is something you all must know, something that will change this story forever." And then unintentionally I was forced to stop my departure, because what he was about to reveal was so big that no heart, including mine, was prepared to hear it. That was the true beginning of everything. Not my humiliation, not the hug with the impostor, not the laughter. The true beginning was the voice of my son-in-law, booming in that hall like thunder, announcing that the truth was about to come out, even if it destroyed us all. The hug I saw that night was not a gesture of innocent affection. It was a dry blow to the soul, a public banishment of my role as a father. While my daughter wrapped her arms around that man, her father-in-law, the impostor, the entire room erupted in applause. Her hands, which one day were so small they fit between my fingers, hardened by work, now clung to the neck of another with a devotion she never offered me. That image remained engraved like a cursed tattoo in my memory. It was as if with that hug she erased me from her history, as if she rewrote our entire life in one stroke, awarding a stranger the years of sacrifice I had given unconditionally. What tormented me most in that instant was not the gesture itself, but the way she pronounced it with those words that resonated like funeral bells. "This is my real father." Hearing them, I felt something inside me tear, as if an organ had been ripped out without anesthesia. It wasn't just an insult. It was a denial of everything we had shared. The girl who one day called me daddy with eyes full of light, who ran to hug me when I arrived tired from the workshop, had become a woman capable of stripping me of my fatherhood in front of hundreds of witnesses. And the worst was the joy drawn on her smile, as if that humiliation gave her pleasure. The impostor, that arrogant father-in-law named David, smiled complacently. His eyes shone with pride, as if he had won a silent battle he had been fighting against me for years. He never told me to my face, but I always knew. He looked at me with disdain. He considered me a vulgar man, a blue-collar worker without class, unworthy of occupying the place of father in my daughter's life. I saw it in his gestures, in the way he corrected his words with fake courtesy, in the way he always found excuses to overshadow my presence at family gatherings. And that night, with that hug, he obtained what he desired so much, the title of true father stolen right before my eyes. As the applause grew, I found myself going over scenes from the past that seemed like ghosts. I remembered when my daughter was little and was afraid of storms. I would hug her tight against my chest. Her tears wet my shirt, and she would tell me, "You are my hero, Daddy." I remembered when she learned to ride a bicycle and fell against the ground, scraping her knees. I ran to her. I lifted her up and encouraged her to try again. "I trust you," she told me then. And now at that party, in front of those clapping hands that seemed like blades, I understood that those words had died. Long before I noticed, the hero had become a villain, and the impostor occupied my throne. The crowd enjoyed the show. Some looked at me with pity, others with indifference, but the majority applauded with enthusiasm. They were witnesses to a betrayal, and instead of being outraged, they celebrated. I felt shame, but also an indignation that burned my skin. How could they applaud? Did no one see what was happening? Was a father's love so disposable that it could be replaced in a toast? No one defended me. No one interrupted the scene. And there I understood that loneliness does not always arrive when one is alone at home, but when one is surrounded by people who decide not to see your pain. The impostor stood up and returned the hug with theatricality. His wide arms surrounded my daughter with solemnity, and his smile widened upon hearing the guests' applause. He seemed to enjoy the spotlight as if that were his true moment of glory. I wondered how many years he had been waiting for that instant. How many whispers must he have planted in my daughter's ear for her to end up convincing herself that he was more of a father than I was, because that betrayal was not born overnight. It was the consequence of something deeper, of something I had overlooked. Trusting blindly in a love that I now discovered was never secured. My daughter looked at me for an instant. It wasn't a long look, barely a flash of her dark eyes on mine, but in that second I knew she had done it on purpose. She wanted me to be there to see how she replaced me, how she proclaimed him in front of everyone. That look was the seal of treason. There was no hesitation, there was no remorse, only a cold pride, almost cruel. And in that gesture, I understood that what I was seeing was not a momentary outburst. It was a final sentence. I sat down again, although inside I was trembling like a man about to collapse. I didn't want to give her the pleasure of seeing me weak, although every fiber of my body asked me to scream. I clung to the edge of the table, breathing deeply, and promised in silence that that humiliation would not go unpunished. If she had decided to hug the impostor and deny me publicly, then I also had to make a decision. And that decision, I sensed already, would not be of forgiveness, but of justice. Because a father can endure ingratitude, in silence can forgive private offenses. But when the name of father is ripped away in public in front of everyone, what is born is no longer just pain. It is a wound that demands a response. And I from that instant swore I would give it. The laughter, I can still hear it. It doesn't matter how many days pass, nor the nights I try to fall asleep, it always returns, like a cruel chorus, mocking in my memory. The sound of 400 hands clapping of clothes, rustling of throats, laughing became an echo that chases me. When I close my eyes, the laughter doesn't die. It multiplies, deforms, mixes with voices from the past. It is as if the whole world had decided to join that mockery, as if I were the clown on a stage from which I could not escape. And there I was, a 60-year-old man turned into an object of scorn by the person I loved most, my own daughter. I remember clearly the moment she pointed at me and said, "Dad, you can leave now." She didn't say it with affection, not even with neutrality. It was a dry order, almost a contempt, spit in the middle of the hall. And the people, instead of being outraged, instead of reacting to the cruelty, laughed. Those laughs were not of surprise or discomfort. They were laughs of complicity. It was as if everyone had been waiting for someone to remove me from that party, as if I were an intruder. That is the image that torments me. The applause that mixed with the mockery. The sound of my expulsion celebrated as a spectacle. I stood up with my dignity in tatters, trying not to show that inside I was crumbling. Every step I took toward the door was accompanied by that echo of laughter. I felt eyes on me. Some looked with contempt, others with indifference, and a few with a pity that was even more humiliating. I walked slowly because my legs seemed made of stone, as if the body itself resisted abandoning its daughter, even though she had rejected me publicly. And as I moved forward, memories of my life with her collided in my mind. It was as if my heart, wounded and bleeding, tried to remind me of everything I had done, like a last desperate attempt to convince me that this could not be happening. I saw in my mind the first time I took her to school. I remember her with her uniform too big for her body, with her hair braided by her mother and the backpack hanging on her back. I took her by the hand, and she nervous squeezed my fingers tightly. "Don't let go, Daddy," she told me, and I promised I never would. Now, decades later, she had let go of me. Not the hand, but the entire heart. And she had done it with the coldest contempt. I felt that my broken promise weighed on my shoulders like a condemnation. Every laugh that resonated behind me was a reminder of my forgotten sacrifices. I remembered when she got chicken pox, and I spent nights awake changing sheets stained with fever while her mother slept exhausted. I remembered the days I worked overtime to buy her a dress she wanted, and how her eyes shone when I gave it to her. I remembered her first bicycle, the walks to the park, the hugs when returning from work. All that which for me were treasures for her were stones thrown into the river of oblivion. And the echo of the laughter told me that everything had been in vain. I reached the door, but I didn't cross it immediately. I put my hand on the handle and stopped. For a moment I thought about turning around, facing everyone, and screaming the truth. I wanted to tell them who I was, what I had done, what it had cost me to raise her, what it meant to me to be her father. I wanted to reclaim my place, but I didn't do it, because I understood that nothing I said would erase what had already been seen. Her words had been more powerful than any defense of mine. I had already been condemned, and the applause was the judge's gavel, sealing the sentence. And then something unexpected happened. Just when I was about to leave, I heard the screech of the microphone. A voice rose over the noise, and the murmur died out. It was my son-in-law's voice. "Enough," he said with a tone that rumbled in the hall. His firmness was like a lightning bolt splitting the air. I remained motionless with my hand still on the door, not daring to take the final step. I turned my head slightly and saw him standing with a serious face, eyes burning, the microphone trembling in his hand. The hall, which seconds before was a party of laughter, fell into a sepulchral silence. "There is something everyone must know," he continued. His words were a prelude, a bell announcing that what was to come would not be just any revelation, but something that would change everything. The guests left their glasses on the tables. The musicians lowered their instruments. My daughter looked at him with bewilderment, and I, paralyzed, understood that that instant would be the true breaking point. The echo of the laughter died, and in its place was born a silence, charged with expectation. And I knew that what I was about to hear would not only change my life, but also that of everyone present. The entire hall was silent. It was not the silence of respect nor of discomfort. It was the tense silence of those who sense that something is about to explode and cannot look away. My son-in-law, still with the microphone in his hand, looked at the guests as if he were in a courtroom. His eyes were firm, but his breathing betrayed him. It was noticeable that that decision had not been easy. I watched him from the door, half a step away from leaving, and for the first time since I entered that hall, I didn't feel invisible. All eyes were no longer on the impostor, hugged by my daughter, but on that man who, against all odds, had decided to speak. "Enough applause," he said with a trembling but firm voice. "There is something you need to hear, something that will change what everyone believes." The murmur of those present tried to resurface, but he raised his hand, and silence imposed itself again. I could see the bewilderment on my daughter's face. Her lips opened in a gesture of protest, but her husband gave her no space. He continued with a strength that seemed fueled by years of kept truths. "This is not her real father." He pointed with his voice breaking, but he wasn't pointing at me. He was pointing at the father-in-law, David. The entire hall held its breath. "And you know it," he added, looking directly at some relatives who averted their eyes with discomfort. I felt the air leaving me. What was he saying? What secret did he keep in that throat, about to break? My daughter, nervous, stepped toward him. "Shut up, please," she whispered. But the microphone caught the plea, and the murmur of the guests transformed into a wave of surprise. He, without looking at her, continued, "I have remained silent too long. I have seen how this man with money and sweet words earned a place that does not belong to him. I have seen how he planted poisonous ideas in your mind, making you believe that your father was a burden and that he was the real one. But today I am not going to allow that lie to continue repeating itself." A collective sigh ran through the room. The impostor, still with the smile frozen on his face, stood up slowly from his seat, trying to maintain composure. "You don't know what you're talking about," he murmured, but the security of his voice wobbled. And my son-in-law, looking at him with a mixture of fury and determination, responded, "Yes, I know, and if I don't speak now, you will end up destroying this family." I felt my legs weakening. Was it possible that that man had been working in the shadows against me even more than I had imagined? Was it possible that all my daughter's contempt had roots in words planted carefully for years? The idea churned my insides, but at the same time gave me a strange relief. Not everything had been born from her. There was someone behind it, manipulating, feeding that contempt. My son-in-law lowered his voice, although the microphone amplified every word. I myself heard the conversations. "I heard how you talked about William, about you father-in-law, saying he was a finished man, that he was useless, that he was only useful for providing money. I heard how you poisoned my wife, telling her she shouldn't feel gratitude, that everything she had was little compared to what you could give her. You built this farce, and today my wife has repeated your words as if they were hers. But no, today I am not going to allow you to continue hiding behind her voice. The hall was a battlefield in silence. No one moved. The impostor stood up, his face unhinged, trying to shake his head, but it was too late. The seeds were exposed to the light. My daughter put her hands to her face, as if suddenly understanding the scope of what was happening. And I, from my place at the door, felt an even deeper pain, because what my son-in-law said could be true, but it also meant that my daughter had chosen that poison instead of my love. He ended with a phrase that still resonates in my ears. Your father is standing here humiliated because of you, and if you have blood in your veins, you should ask for his forgiveness. Because this man, pointing at me, is the one who gave you life, and the other one only stole your memory. There was a sepulchral silence after those words. No one dared to applaud. No one moved. My daughter, between tears and fury, remained paralyzed in the middle of the hall. The impostor collapsed in his chair, unable to sustain the gaze of those present, and I, with my hand still on the door, knew that what had just happened was barely the beginning of a storm that would wipe us all out. When the echo of my son-in-law's words still resonated in my ears, my mind began to go back, as if the painful present forced me to seek answers in the past. At what exact moment did my daughter's path twist? Where did the bond I believed indestructible break? Because no one is born hating their father. No one arrives in the world with contempt already planted in their heart. Hate, indifference, disdain, all that is cultivated like a weed that someone waters day after day until covering the entire garden. And then I started reviewing my daughter's childhood, not with the sweetness with which I used to remember it, but with the painfully open eyes of someone who finally understands that every gesture, every word, every omission was a brick in the wall that now separated me from her. The first image that came to my mind was her barely 3 years old, playing on the living room floor, while I finished fixing a broken door. I remember she approached, and with childish clumsiness, wanted to pass me a nail imitating my movements. Her little eyes shone with pride, believing she was helping me. I lifted her up and sat her on my knees, telling her, "You are my best helper." Her laughter filled the room. In that instant, I was sure our union would be eternal, that nothing and no one could break the tenderness of those years. But now, looking back, I ask myself, when was that shine erased from her eyes? When did I stop being her hero to become her burden? The answer, perhaps, was in small episodes that at the time I didn't know how to interpret. I remember when she was 7 years old and returned from her maternal grandparents' house saying, "Grandpa says you work too much and that Mom would be better off with another man." I froze. I answered calmly, trying to deflect her words, but that phrase stayed with me like a thorn. It was an early seed of doubt, of distrust toward me planted in the mind of a girl, too innocent to defend me. I didn't see it then, but now I understand that those types of comments were not isolated. They were constant drops, a silent dripping that over the years formed a river that dragged her away from me. There was a day when she was 12 years old that she returned from school crying because she didn't have brand-name sneakers like her classmates. I, with a tight salary, had managed to buy her some resistant ones, good for running and playing even if they didn't have a famous logo. That night she looked at me with red eyes and told me, "I wish my mom had married someone who could give me what I deserve." I didn't understand where those words came from, but they hurt like whips. I smiled, trying to hide my wound, and promised her I would buy her those sneakers soon. I worked overtime, deprived myself of necessities, and in the end, I bought them. She smiled when trying them on, but that day I knew something had changed. My sacrifice was no longer sufficient. It had become an obligation I had to fulfill to be considered worthy of her affection. When adolescence arrived, the distance became more evident. She no longer wanted me to take her to school. She was ashamed to be seen with me. She said I smelled of varnish, of sweat of wood, and that her friends had fathers who wore suits and ties. I listened to her laugh at my rough hands when I tried to caress her face, and I accepted it, believing it was a passing stage. I thought every teenager rejects their parents at some point, and that later, upon growing up, she would learn to value what I had to endure. But no, what I thought was a phase was actually the beginning of a path of no return. There were also signs of tenderness, of course, moments where the girl who called me hero seemed to return. There were nights she asked me to read her stories, even being older, and I did it happily because in those stories it seemed we recovered the lost bond. There were afternoons she showed me her drawings and said, "Look, Dad, this is you in your workshop." I kept every paper as if they were relics. But now that I think about it, those moments were like sparks in the middle of a storm, flashes that went out too quickly. College was the final blow. She chose an expensive career in an institution where appearance weighed more than knowledge. I sold tools, mortgaged the little I had got into debt to limits that drowned me. But I didn't tell her anything because I didn't want her to think she lacked anything. And yet instead of thanking me, she began to compare me even more with her father-in-law, David, who gave her luxuries and trips. One day, with a coldness that froze me, she told me, "He supports me more than you, even if you are not my blood father." That phrase left me paralyzed. I stood looking at her without understanding because I never doubted my paternity. Where had that idea come from? Who had sown that poisonous doubt? It was in that instant, remembering it now, that I understood. My daughter no longer saw me as a father for a long time. I was for her an ATM, a man who had to give shut up and disappear when he didn't fit in her world of appearances. And every memory of sacrifice, of dedication, of love, transformed now into proofs of my naivety. I myself had built the foundations of her ingratitude. I gave her so much that I accustomed her to believe everything was hers by right, and others from the shadows, finished convincing her that I was never enough. The deception did not begin at that party, nor even in adolescence. The deception was brewing since childhood, in every poisonous word, in every unfair comparison, in every luxury I couldn't give. And the most painful of all is that I, with my silence and my sacrifice, helped those foundations to rise. My love became her weapon to despise me. And that night when I saw her hug the impostor and deny my name, I understood that what had occurred was the result of years of deception carefully built. There is a shadow that never abandons me, even if she no longer walks on this earth. The shadow of Linda, my wife, my daughter's mother. Her absence weighs as much as her presence in life, and sometimes I think that even though she is dead, she keeps speaking through my daughter, because every word of contempt I received that night on her birthday, every look of arrogance, every rejection reminded me of her, of Linda. When I met her, she was a young woman of serene beauty, with an air that commanded respect and a strong character that dazzled me. I was a boy with weather-beaten hands, with more dreams than certainties, and I looked at her like someone contemplating a miracle. I had no riches to offer her, barely a fair salary, and an uncertain future. But I did have an unconditional love that burned in my chest, and I believed it would be enough. How naive I was! Linda always desired more than I could give her. And although at first she hid it behind smiles and caresses, over the years, she started showing that what I offered was not enough. Our marriage was marked by silences that hurt more than shouts. She never insulted me openly, never disrespected me in public, but every gesture, every whispered comment was placing me in a corner. I remember when the economy was tough, and I arrived exhausted from the workshop, she would tell me, "I wish you could offer your daughter something more, not just effort." That phrase, repeated in different forms, was like a constant hammer hitting me. I remained silent, believing silence was the best way to keep the peace. But what I didn't understand then was that while I was silent, my daughter listened. She listened to each of those phrases and stored them in her memory. There were nights we argued in low voices, believing she was sleeping. Linda claimed I hadn't accepted working with her brother-in-law, who offered me a position in a company even if that meant abandoning my workshop. "With your pride, we will never get ahead," she told me. I defended my passion, the work of my hands. But in my daughter's eyes, I surely remained as an obstinate man, incapable of giving them the status Linda craved so much. Without intending to, my daughter was learning that her father was synonymous with limitation, while other men with suits, with money, with influences were synonymous with power. I remember a scene that now chases me. My daughter must have been about 10 years old. She had gotten an outstanding grade at school, and I congratulated her enthusiastically, promising her I would take her to the park to celebrate. But Linda took her in her arms and told her in a low voice, believing I wasn't listening, "I wish your father could give you something better than a walk." That phrase fell like poison into the girl's heart. I saw it in her eyes. The illusion of the park went out instantly. And that day I understood that my love, however pure and honest, was no longer enough for her. Linda's death changed nothing, or rather it changed everything, but for the worse. Because when she died, I thought my daughter and I would get closer, that we would unite in pain and rebuild our life together. But the opposite happened. Her absence became a constant echo of her reproaches. My daughter repeated her mother's phrases as if they were indisputable truths. Sometimes, without looking at me, she murmured, "Mom said you didn't know how to dream," or "Mom always said we deserved something better." Every word was a dagger because it didn't just hurt me, but reminded me that even dead Linda continued poisoning the relationship between my daughter and me. Linda's shadow became a specter in our house. In every important decision, my daughter wondered what her mother would have thought and rarely consulted me. When she met her current husband, I remember she said, "Mom would have been proud that I chose someone like him." And I, although it hurt, kept quiet, because I was already used to being the second-rate man, the one who was there by obligation, not by choice. Now, remembering all that, I realized that humiliation on her birthday was only the culmination of a process that began much earlier. Linda, with her words, with her nonconformity, was sowing in my daughter the idea that I was not enough. And although she is no longer here, her voice remains alive in my daughter's memory, transformed into contempt toward me. Linda's shadow accompanies me even today, dark and cold, like a sentence that never ends. That night, when I saw my daughter hug her father-in-law and deny me, I felt it wasn't just her rejecting me. It was Linda from the grave laughing at me once more. The man my daughter called real father was nothing more than a carefully disguised impostor. I have observed him for years, always in silence, always from a corner, like a wolf stalking the flock until finding the moment to attack. His name is David, but in my mind I have baptized him differently, the false father. Not because he usurped my place innocently, but because he did it with premeditation, with calculation, with that coldness that only men used to gaining ground over others have, without the invasion being noticed. David appeared in my daughter's life as a kind presence. At first he was the polite man who treated her with attention, who gave her pretty words, who made her feel part of his political family, as if he were adopting her. I saw him approaching with flowers, with smiles, with phrases loaded with flattery. And my daughter, eager for recognition, absorbed every gesture as if it were a treasure. I tried to tell myself there was nothing wrong with it, that every father dreams of seeing his daughter loved by her husband's family. But there was something in his look that made me uncomfortable. That way of looking me up and down with contempt disguised as courtesy, as if every time he saw me he thought, "You don't deserve to be here, I do." What started as small gestures of kindness grew into influence. David became a counselor, a confidant, the voice my daughter listened to with attention. If I gave her advice, she questioned it. But if he said exactly the same thing, she accepted it as absolute truth. Over time, she began to mention him in our conversations, more than she mentioned her own father. David thinks that. David told me that. Until one day she told me directly, Dad David understands me better than you. That phrase, which should have set off all my alarms, paralyzed me, because I realized he was no longer a simple father-in-law. He had infiltrated the most intimate space of our relationship, displacing me without me being able to defend myself. David had a powerful weapon, money. While I struggled to give what I could with my work, he appeared with expensive gifts, trips, dinners in elegant places. My daughter, raised among my sacrifices, started to compare. She no longer saw the value of the overtime hours I worked to pay for her college, but was dazzled by the luxuries he could offer her effortlessly. And David, aware of that difference, didn't waste it. Every gift of his was a stone in the wall that separated me from my daughter. Every word of his was a drop of poison reinforcing the idea that I was not enough. I'm not saying it was all his fault. My daughter had the choice not to be seduced by that false shine. But David knew exactly where to attack. He knew about my past with Linda. He knew the reproaches she made me, and he took it upon himself to repeat them in a low voice until my daughter made them hers. Your father didn't know how to take advantage of his opportunities. Your father didn't know how to give your mother the life she deserved. Phrases I heard once from Linda's mouth and now heard deformed on my daughter's lips. They weren't new words. They were echoes David had revived like embers he never let die out. I remember one day in particular. My daughter and I had an argument because she wanted a car that was out of my reach. I explained I couldn't, that I was still paying part of her tuition. She cried, screamed that I had always had excuses, and left the house, slamming the door. That same week, David appeared with the car she wanted, with a huge red bow on the roof. The smile on my daughter's face upon receiving it was like a dagger in mine. He hadn't just stolen the place of provider father. He had also turned my "I can't" into a confirmation that I was, according to him, a failure. From then on, David became the center of her phrases of gratitude. She called him an example, presented him as a role model, and I, increasingly cornered, saw how my place crumbled, until the final blow arrived. That night, at her birthday, when she hugged him and named him her real father. In that instant, I understood David hadn't won just with money, nor with flattery, but with years of a silent war in which I, without realizing it, never had a chance to win. I observed him while everyone applauded. His smile wasn't of joy, it was of triumph. He didn't need to say it. His look screamed it at me. He had achieved what he always wanted, robbing me of the most sacred thing my daughters love. And I, powerless, was a witness to my own defeat. But something told me that battle wasn't finished, because while everyone applauded, my son-in-law held the microphone, and his truth was about to demolish the castle of appearances David had built. And I, in the deepest part of my being, knew that the mask of the false father wouldn't last much longer. There is something that hurts more than an insult, discovering that contempt was not born in an instant, but grew slowly, like a cursed seed planted in my daughter's heart, and that I, without realizing it, helped water with my own silences. Because no one goes from loving their father to hating him from one day to the next. Contempt is cultivated, fed, strengthened with gestures, comparisons, and words that drop by drop mold the vision a child has of their father. And in my daughter's case, that seed germinated early, and I, blind with love, didn't want to see it. The first time I felt that distance was when she was barely 13. She had argued with me because I couldn't buy her a brand-name dress her friends wore. She screamed at me, "You never have money. You can never give me what I want." I remained silent without defending myself, with my heart squeezed tight, and promised her I would find a way to buy it. But I didn't do it immediately. And shortly after I saw her go out with the same dress, a gift from David. Her eyes shone, and while looking in the mirror, she murmured, "He does know how to take care of me." That phrase was a poison I never forgot. What for me were limits for her were proofs of my incapacity. Adolescence became fertile ground for that contempt to grow. When I scolded her for staying out late, she answered that I didn't understand modern life, that I was an old-fashioned man. When I tried to advise her on dangerous friendships, she accused me of being controlling and not trusting her. And every time she sought refuge in someone, she ran to David, who with a soft voice told her the opposite of what I tried to teach her. Thus slowly I became the authoritarian and limited figure, while he was the understanding man, the ally. What hurt me most weren't her words of rebellion, because every teenager has outbursts, but that those words were too adult, too calculated to be hers alone. They were learned phrases repeated like lessons. I remember once she screamed at me, "Mom always said you were a conformist, and David thinks so too." I listened to her and felt a hole open under my feet. It wasn't her speaking. It was the voices of the dead and the living conspiring against me in her mind. Still, I never stopped giving her the little and the much I had. I paid for her college, even though I was drowning in debt. I sold tools to cover her trips. I worked until my hands bled so she never lacked what she asked for. But my sacrifice no longer had value. It became an obligation. There was never a thank you, never a gesture of recognition. And the worst was that when I gave her something, she compared it to what David offered her. Always bigger, brighter, more expensive. My efforts always remained in second place, as if they were crumbs barely fulfilling a function. Over the years, that contempt normalized became her way of speaking to me. Phrases like, "You don't understand," or "I wish you were more like David," became habitual. I swallowed my pain, convinced myself it was youth that time would open her eyes. But time did nothing but harden her. And we arrived at that night, that birthday, where in front of everyone she banished me from her life with one phrase. It wasn't a sudden betrayal. It was the bitter harvest of the seed sown years ago. My daughter's contempt wasn't born only from her mother's influence or David's. It was also born from me, from my silences, from my resignations, from having allowed others to occupy my place instead of defending it. I was too patient, too confident that love would cure everything. And no, love, when not defended, wears out, deforms, and finally dies in the other's mind. That night I understood it with brutal clarity. My daughter didn't hate me for what I did or didn't do, but because she learned to see me as the man who was never enough. And that vision, repeated year after year, had become truth for her. I was no longer her hero, no longer her refuge. I was a burden she could dispense with. And when I saw her hug the impostor with such conviction, I understood that seed had grown to become a huge tree whose roots clung to her heart. A tree watered by David, fertilized by Linda, and permitted by my silence. My daughter's contempt wasn't a lightning bolt that fell suddenly. It was a fire that burned for years until consuming everything that once united us. And in the smoke of that fire I remained standing, reduced to ashes, but with a new flame born inside me, the flame of justice. The murmur of the people had disappeared. The hall, which minutes before was a river of laughter, applause, and clinking glasses, was now silenced by my son-in-law's firm voice. I had never seen him like this. He was always a reserved man, one of those who prefer to observe in silence rather than speak. I took him for someone correct, yes, but I never imagined he would have the courage to face his own wife and her family in such a brutally public setting. And yet there he was standing, microphone in hand, barely trembling, but with firm eyes ready to say what everyone feared to hear. "This man," he said, pointing at me, "is not a burden, as some here have made it seem. He is the true father, the only one who deserves that name." The air was cut in the hall. I remained paralyzed. No one had ever pronounced those words in my defense. Not like that, not with that strength. People shifted in their chairs, some uncomfortable, others surprised, others incredulous. And then my son-in-law continued, with his voice breaking, but without stopping. What happened today is a shame, and not only for what was said to him, but for what has been hidden for years. It is time for everyone to know the truth. My daughter stood up suddenly, running toward him. Stop! Please don't say anything, she begged, pulling his arm. Her eyes were wild, as if she knew exactly what truth he spoke of. But he pushed her aside gently and looked at her with a strange pain, like someone who loves, but can no longer stand the lie. Forgive me, he told her in a low voice, but the microphone picked up those two words and projected them throughout the hall. And in that instant, I understood that what was about to come out of his mouth was not just a defense towards me, but a confession that dragged him down too. He took a breath, closed his eyes for a second, and said, Your father-in-law is not who he appears to be. He has manipulated, your daughter has sown doubts and poison in her heart. But that is not the worst. The worst is that he hid a truth that changes everything. Linda, your mother, and David had a secret relationship, and there is the possibility that your daughter is not William's daughter, but his. The impact was devastating. A roar of voices rose among the guests. Screams, exclamations, disbelief. The hall became a boiling pot of murmurs, and I felt the ground disappear beneath my feet. I froze, my heart beating in my chest like a hammer. I looked at my daughter. She was pale, mouth open, unable to react. The impostor David tried to stand up, but his legs betrayed him, and he fell back into the chair, face unhinged. My son-in-law did not hesitate. I heard those conversations. David admitted it on more than one occasion, believing it would never come to light. He said he had loved Linda in secret, that he accompanied her in moments when William was working, that there were nights when she was not alone. And although it was never officially proven, he always insinuated that your daughter could be his. Silence imposed itself again, heavier than ever. People looked at each other, unable to process what they had just heard, and I felt a dagger go through my chest. Had my whole life been a lie, the girl I hugged raised defended tooth, and nail, wasn't she mine? My hands trembled. A part of me screamed. It couldn't be true that it was a cruel invention, but another part, the most wounded, remembered all the times Linda looked at me with a strange silence, all the nights she stayed out of the house, all the ambiguous words I never wanted to decipher. My daughter screamed then with tears in her eyes, You're lying. That can't be true. But her voice had no strength. It was a scream of desperation more than conviction. David, on the verge of collapse, tried to speak. That was many years ago. It meant nothing. But his words fell like stones in a swamp. No one believed him any more. No one could save him from that revelation. And I, standing at the door, understood that that was the true motive for everything. That my daughter's contempt, her rejection, hadn't been born only from David's poison, nor from comparisons with my poverty. It had been born from something deeper, from the doubt sown in her own identity. If all her life she had suspected I wasn't her real father, then her rejection toward me wasn't just ingratitude. It was the expression of a void impossible to fill. The hall turned into chaos. Some stood up indignant. Others left murmuring. Others tried to console my daughter, who collapsed on the floor, crying inconsolably. And I, with a broken heart, didn't take another step outside. I stayed there leaning on the door with a lost gaze, because that night I understood I had lost much more than my daughter's respect. Perhaps I had also lost the certainty of being her father. The silence that followed my son-in-law's revelation was the heaviest I have ever experienced in my life. It wasn't the uncomfortable silence of a social error, nor that of a pause in a speech. It was a dense silence like that of a church after a confessed sin, a silence that hurt the ears and the soul. No one knew what to do. No one knew where to look. I, myself standing by the door, felt trapped in a reality I couldn't comprehend. My heart, old and tired, seemed about to explode. Was it true what my son-in-law had said? Was it possible my daughter didn't carry my blood? My entire life had been built on a lie. My legs trembled, but I forced myself to remain firm. I couldn't allow myself to crumble in front of everyone. They had already humiliated me once that night, and if I fell to the floor, it would be the end of the little dignity I had left. I looked at David, that impostor, who had smiled in front of me so many times as if I were a ridiculous man, and I saw him collapsed in his chair, face unhinged like a thief caught in the middle of a crime. His lips murmured excuses, but the fear in his eyes gave him away. There was truth in my son-in-law's words, a truth he didn't expect to come to light. My daughter, on the other hand, was torn to pieces. I saw her fall to her knees, crying, trembling, not knowing who to look at. For an instant I wanted to run to hug her, wanted to console her like when she was a child and was afraid of the dark. But I held back, because that hug wasn't mine. It didn't belong to me anymore. She had ripped me from her life that same night, proclaiming another man as her real father, and now faced with the possibility that that father was her mother's lover, she was lost in a sea of doubts. The punishment was there. It wasn't me punishing her. It was the truth itself tearing her apart. The guests shifted in their seats, some indignant, others with morbid curiosity. The scandal was too big. "Is it true what he says?" someone asked from the back, and the murmur spread like an unstoppable fire. David tried to stand up to defend himself, but could barely stammer. "That was many years ago. Linda, I loved her." His voice broke, and the room exploded in a chorus of whispers and exclamations. There was no going back. The man who had usurped my place had been left naked in front of everyone, his mask shattered. I observed him and didn't feel relief. There was no pleasure in seeing him fall. What I felt was a sadness so deep it consumed my bones, because his defeat didn't erase my pain nor return my daughter to me, nor erase years of contempt. The truth was a punishment, yes, but it was a punishment for everyone. For me, who now doubted my paternity. For my daughter, who saw her entire world crumble. For David, who was exposed as the traitor he was. And for Linda, who, although dead, would now be remembered not as an exemplary mother, but as an unfaithful woman. I forced myself to speak. I felt, if I kept silent, I would be consumed from within. I took a few steps forward. The murmur died down, and with a firm voice I said, "I want everyone to hear something. I don't know if my daughter carries my blood or not. The truth may have been hidden for years. But what I do know is that it was I who raised her. I who held her in my arms when she was a baby. I who took care of her when she got sick. I who sacrificed to give her a future. No one can deny me that. No one." My voice trembled, but every word came out loaded with a strength that surprised me. I looked at my daughter crying on the floor and added, "If one day you discover I am not your blood father, remember that blood is not everything. Being a father is being there. It is giving. It is loving." And I did that. Even if today you reject me, even if today you deny me, no one can erase that truth. The hall remained in absolute silence. Some looked at me with respect, others with shame, unable to hold my gaze. I saw my daughter raise her face, tears furrowing her cheeks, and for an instant I thought I saw in her eyes the girl to whom I was once a hero. But that flash went out quickly, replaced by confusion and shame. The damage was done. That night I understood something that will accompany me to the grave. The truth is a punishment that doesn't ask permission. It arrives when least expected and destroys everything in its path. It didn't return my daughter to me. It didn't give me comfort. It didn't bring me justice. The only thing it did was leave everyone in that hall in ruins. But in those ruins, in the midst of pain, I also knew I had recovered something that had been taken from me, my voice, my dignity. And although every bone still ached, I swore it wouldn't be the end. The true punishment was just beginning. After that night, I stayed a long time sitting in the darkness of my house with my soul torn to shreds and my body empty of strength. I closed my eyes and heard my son-in-law's voice again, my daughter's scream, the guests' murmurs. and above all, the revelation that changed everything, the possibility that she wasn't my blood daughter. That doubt pierced me like a hot iron. The question burned me. Was she mine, or was she the fruit of Linda's deception? I could take tests, could seek scientific answers. But I didn't have the courage, because I feared the result would rip away the last thread of hope. And then I understood my battle was no longer about knowing whose blood my daughter carried. My battle was for something bigger, to recover my dignity and do justice for all the years I was treated as less. In the following days, I thought a lot about what had happened. The public humiliation was a wound, yes, but also a spark. Something inside me, something that had remained asleep for years of silences and sacrifices, woke up. A voice repeated to me, "Enough silence, enough enduring." It was as if everything I had swallowed for decades was asking to come to the surface at once. And I knew I couldn't let that revelation remain a passing scandal party gossip. No, this had to transform into a definitive reckoning. I began to plan calmly, like a worker erecting a building step by step. The first thing was to organize my memories, my proofs, my sacrifices. I looked for receipts, letters, photographs, documents that demonstrated everything I did for my daughter since she was born. I took out of a drawer the college promissory notes, loan contracts, overtime records. Every paper was a wound, but also a testimony. I wanted to make clear to whoever needed to know that, blood or not, I had been the only real father. The second thing was to investigate David, the impostor, the man who had gained ground behind my back until snatching my daughter's affection. For years I looked at him with silent contempt, but never bothered to look beyond his mask. Now it was different. I needed to know him for real, strip his secrets, expose him to the same world that applauded him when my daughter called him father. I discovered his fortune wasn't as clean as it appeared, that there were shady deals with suppliers, debts hidden under companies and other relatives' names, political favors that sustained him. I wasn't surprised. A man capable of stealing my place in my daughter's heart was also capable of corrupting everything he touched. While collecting information, I thought of my daughter, not as the woman who threw me out with contempt on her birthday, but as the girl who once hugged me in fear of storms. And then I felt something strange. I didn't want revenge on her. My daughter was a victim too, even if she didn't recognize it. She had been molded by the wrong voices, by comparisons, by her mother's lies and David's manipulations. My justice wouldn't be against her. No, my justice would be against the man who dared to call himself real father, against the impostor who usurped what I built with blood and sweat. The plan began to take shape. I couldn't do it with shouts or violence because that would only make me look like a resentful old man. It had to be meticulous, precise, unappealable. Justice had to come disguised as truth, as proofs no one could refute. And at the same time, it had to be public as the humiliation I suffered. Because what they did to me wasn't in secret. It was in front of 400 people. And the reparation, the revenge, had to be equally loud. One night while reviewing the documents, I understood I had two weapons in my hands: the truth of Linda and David's infidelity, and the proofs of his dirty business dealings. I could use one, I could use the other, or I could use both like a hammer to destroy him without remedy. But I was in no hurry. Haste is the enemy of justice. I wanted David to feel the same thing. I felt that night, the waiting, the uncertainty, the fear of not knowing at what moment the blow would fall. My son-in-law, who had started the scandal, came to see me a few days later. I saw him arrive with slumped shoulders, as if he had aged 10 years in a single night. He asked for my forgiveness. "I didn't want to hurt you, but I couldn't keep silent anymore," he told me. I listened to him in silence and for the first time looked at him with respect. That man, who had also suffered the contempt of his wife, influenced by David, had had more courage than I. I answered him, "You didn't hurt me. You opened a door that should have been opened long ago. And from that moment, I knew it. I wasn't alone in this battle. He would be a key piece in my plan. Weeks passed. The scandal faded in people's rumors, but I kept working in silence. Every day was another brick in the wall of my justice. I hired a private investigator, a discreet man who knew how to move in the shadows, to follow David's steps. What he discovered was worse than I imagined. Hidden accounts abroad, bribes to officials, properties bought with straw men. It was an empire built on sand, and I had in my hands the wind that would make it fall. I won't deny there were nights I doubted. I wondered if it wasn't too late, if it was worth spending my last years on revenge. But every time I remembered the guests' laughter, my daughter's cold look when she kicked me out, and David's victorious smile upon receiving that hug, the fire lit up again. It wasn't just for me. It was for the truth, for justice, for all the fathers who were ever treated like shadows. I decided the place where my revenge would begin, the next family gathering, there where everyone believed appearances would prevail again. There I would put the proofs on the table. There would be no shouts, no insults, only documents, photographs, irrefutable truths. I would make every person who applauded that day see with their own eyes the man they celebrated, stripped of his masks. And when the truth fell, there would be no way to turn back. That night, as I went to bed, I thought of Linda, of what she would say if she saw me now in this meticulous plan I was raising against the man who was once her lover. Maybe she would call me cruel. Maybe she would accuse me of destroying my daughter's memory. But I didn't care anymore. Throughout my life, I was the man who kept quiet, who bowed his head, who endured. Not anymore. The humiliation at that birthday had been the last straw. Now I was going to speak, and my voice would be so strong no one could ignore it. I chose the day and place with the calm of someone who has learned not to rush. Revenge, I thought, must have the form of truth and the precision of a Swiss watch. We summoned the family under the pretext of a dinner to mend broken ties. A talk to clear the air, I said on the invitation, because no one suspects that cleaning the air can turn into a storm that tears roofs off. The hall had the same carpet where birthdays and baptisms were celebrated in yesteryear. The photos on the wall looked at me like old witnesses. I seated everyone around the long table. My daughter arrived with eyes still swollen from the latest crisis. David entered with the rigidity of someone knowing they are watched. The father-in-law with restless hands sought allies with his gaze. My son-in-law, who had been the trigger of the scandal and my unexpected partner, in truth, sat silently by my side. I had in the folder the laboratory result, the recordings, the invoices, the transfers, and something else. The documentation demonstrating the tricks of a man who had wanted to usurp a name. I spoke first of Linda, not to defend her honor, which could no longer be saved, but to remember that behind every lie there are broken childhoods and decisions made in the dark. I recounted with a steady voice nights of fever, school mornings tools sold to pay a semester. I looked my daughter in the eye and didn't accuse her. I invited her to look with me to see the scattered pieces of a story someone tried to rewrite. Then with the same calm, I began to display evidence. I showed messages, private conversations where insinuations were revealed, calls that hinted at agreements. I put before them the photographs where David appeared, at Linda's homes at uncomfortable hours, and I heard how the room grew tense, like a bow tightening before releasing the arrow. The first blow wasn't direct confrontation, but the playback of a recording no one expected. David's voice confessing in a careless dialogue that he had maintained a relationship with Linda, that he had fed intentions and sown doubts, that he had worked so my name would be relegated to the shadow. The recording sounded clear without cuts, like the key opening a secret door. I saw his hands tremble, his jaw clench, and my daughter turned pale as if the floor were missing. It wasn't joy I felt hearing it. It was a deep sadness, The fall of one who believed himself invincible returned years of shadows to me, but it fixed nothing of what was lost. The truth, although powerful, hurts before curing. Then came the envelope. I had kept it like a talisman for weeks, the result of the DNA test that with the mixture of cowardice and hope accompanying old men I ordered done in secret. That night, trembling, I opened the envelope and placed the sheet on the table. It wasn't vanity. It was the cornerstone of my life. I read aloud the laboratory's words, the figures indicating what bones and blood already knew in silence. Genetic match. Probability greater than 99%. My daughter listened without understanding at first. Then her hands went to her mouth. Her eyes sought mine with a question that had no immediate answer. The room broke into murmurs. Some relatives looked at each other with guilt, others with surprise. David, disarmed, let out a sound that seemed like an apology to the void. Showing the DNA wasn't an act of pride, but of vindication. I wanted the truth to rest on irrefutable evidence, that no word of falsehood could stand before the weight of science. And while the sheet traveled through glances, I continued. I had saved the best and the worst. The proofs of David's economic web, accounts in third parties' names, transfers justifying gifts and trips, fictitious contracts with suppliers who later collected in cash. I didn't speak of money out of greed. I spoke of mechanisms. Those that turn affections into merchandise deserve to be seen. I put invoices and statements in front of everyone and observed how the defense structure the impostor had built cracked. My daughter couldn't take it. She stood up, walked a few steps, came back, and hugged me with the urgency of someone repairing a landscape in ruins. "Forgive me, Dad," she said between sobs, and her voice was a thread recovering childhood for an instant. It wasn't a complete forgiveness, nor did she ask to forget the damage. She asked for the truth to strip her of the weight of doubt and pride. I felt her on my chest like a small resurrection. I took her hands, felt her cold fingers, and spoke to her from the simplest truth. I was the one who took care of you. No one erases that. I didn't know if my words were enough. I didn't know if time could repair what was broken. But in that hug, I knew we had recovered a starting point. David tried to save his honor with clumsy excuses and calculated gestures. He tried to make offers, discuss compensations, fix it as if damage could be paid with money. Many relatives looked the other way ashamed. Others murmured that the family would no longer be the same. But my goal wasn't to destroy for the sake of destroying. When I finished displaying the truth, I proposed a path, so the damage at least had constructive consequences. I offered that the assets susceptible to claim and funds that could be recovered from irregularities be destined for a workshop for young people and scholarships, in memory of what Linda and I couldn't offer. I didn't want senseless revenge. I wanted to transform the scandal into reparation. The decision wasn't unanimous. There were shouts, reproaches. Someone called the police, and someone sought agreements in low voices. In the end, however, the evidence was compelling enough for the pieces to start moving in a direction that didn't favor the one who had sold his respect for a title. I left that meeting with an exhausted soul, but with the sensation for the first time in years that my name wouldn't be erased by another's whim. We raised a glass in silence. It wasn't a toast of triumph, but an act of closure. I toasted for my daughter, for the childhood we had rescued, for the dignity that, although late, had a voice again. While the first shadows of the afternoon fogged the glass, I thought of Linda, of her defects and her tenderness, of what united us and what separated us. The truth had stripped her naked, placed her before history as she was. I did not seek for them to hate her. I only wanted her to no longer serve as a weapon. I went home empty-handed and with a less shrunken heart. Revenge had taken the form of justice, and justice, when exact, doesn't deliver pleasure but relief. I didn't recover the stolen years. I didn't erase the laughter that made me feel small. But I recovered my name, and with it the possibility of looking in the mirror again, without an impostor's voice confusing me. In the end, what this story leaves us is a hard lesson. Love, trust, and dignity are fragile, and when betrayed, they leave deep scars. Sometimes justice takes time, but it always arrives, and what seemed like a defeat becomes a truth that liberates. If this story moved you, I invite you to like the video and subscribe to the channel William's Revenge Stories. Remember to hit the bell because every day we have new stories that touch the heart and invite us to reflect on life.